So let's go ahead and talk about trig in the inverse of trig functions today. So we have just finished going about the fact that I know that the sine, say, of pi over 2 is equal to 1. So that's what we just finished doing in the last section, given this. Now, if I ever write the sine in the inverse of the sine of 1, then that means I am looking for what angle that happens at. And that tells me that the angle is equal to 1. Now, be really careful with this. The inverse function, that -1, it does not mean that that is equal to the cosecant. The cosecant is a reciprocal function. The cosecant is equal to 1 over the sine of any theta. And while this -1 looks like the same notation, it does not mean the same thing. Another way we say this is we talk about this as being the arc sine. So be careful that this -1 does not mean it is 1 over the function. It means it's the arc sine, or it is the inverse of that particular trig function. So to summarize, the sine of any angle theta is equal to that ratio, and that ratio could be in the term of the opposite over the hypotenuse. If it was a trig function, it could possibly be, or any kind of point on the unit circle. And since the sine, it would be the y value over 1 on that unit circle. So whenever you have the inverse of any ratio, you are finding the angle. Now, sometimes those are going to be exact values. So where does the cosine of have a value of -square root of 2 over 2? I want to find that. So if I look at my unit circle, where does that happen? Well, first of all, I am looking that this is going to be a negative value of cosine. And any point that I have on my unit circle, right here, that point is always x, y. So this represents a point on the unit circle, and this is negative because it's cosine. That is, and cosine represents the x value. So the cosine has to be over here in these two quadrants. So where does this happen at? Where could theta possibly be? Theta is here. And that is at 3 pi over 4. In the other quadrant, it could be down here, is in the third quadrant, and that happens at 5 pi over 4. So theta has two different values that are between 0 and 2 pi, and I know that theta is equal to 3 pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4. We can also do this in the calculator. Watch the video next to this one for the calculator demonstration. We also have nested trig functions. And by nested trig functions, let's say I have the inverse sine of sine 2 pi over 3. Whenever I have the outside trig function and the inside trig function and these match, the answer is just the same thing. It's like if you multiply a number times 3 and then divide by 3, you get the same answer. And that happens only if this inside portion is inside the domain of each of the inverse trig functions. The domain of the inverse of the sine all those values for theta have to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. If I'm looking for the cosine and the inverse of the cosine, all of those values for theta, they have to be between 0 and pi. And the last one, if I have the inverse function of the tangent, all of those values have to be the same range. It matches with the sine at negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. And we'll delve into this more when we graph these functions. Now let's go ahead and look at a question like this where we have a domain that we have to look at. So if I go ahead and say I have the cosine inverse function of the cosine of 4 pi over 3. Now what you'll see is that this 4 pi over 3, that's larger than pi. So I can't just say that it's equal to 4 pi over 3 because that's outside of the domain of the cosine. So what I have to do is do the inside first. And again, I know based upon my unit circle that the angle is down here. And this point on my unit circle is negative 1/2. Sorry, let me draw that angle in. That is 4 pi over 3 as far as the angle. That point is negative 1/2 negative square root of 3 over 2. And because I'm looking for the cosine, I'm looking for my x value. So then I know that the cosine, all of the inside, that simplifies to negative 1/2. And where is the reference value of that? So where does the cosine equal negative 1/2? It's up here at 2 pi over 3.